The dinner party was in full swing when it happened. Crystal glasses clinked, expensive wine flowed, and somewhere in that vast dining room, a deal worth millions was being sealed. I was in the kitchen, wiping down marble countertops that cost more than everything I owned, when I heard little footsteps on the stairs. My heart dropped. Sophie was supposed to be asleep. She appeared in the doorway, 6 years old, barefoot. Clutching the stuffed rabbit I'd sewn patches on 3 times already. Her eyes were wide and wet. She didn't look at her father, surrounded by his investors. She looked at me, and then she said it, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Mommy, I had a nightmare." The room went silent. Every fork stopped mid-air. Every conversation died. I felt my blood turn to ice as all those eyes turned toward me. The help, the woman in the plain uniform, standing frozen by the sink. Richard's face went from surprise to fury in less than a second. I tried to gently correct her, my voice shaking. "Sophie, sweetheart, I'm not—" But she ran to me anyway, wrapping her small arms around my legs. "You are," she insisted, confused now, her voice breaking. "You're always here. You're my mom." That's when Richard stood up, his chair scraping loud against the imported Italian tile. "You're fired," he said, his voice cold and sharp as glass. "Pack your things. You're out of here by morning." I didn't yell. I didn't cry, not in front of them. I just looked at Sophie, her tear-streaked face pressed against my apron, and whispered, "I'm so sorry, mi amor." Then I walked out of that kitchen, out of that cold, beautiful house, and into a night that felt like the end of everything. But it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a battle I never thought I'd have the courage to fight. I came to the United States 10 years ago with nothing but a borrowed suitcase and a prayer folded in my pocket. My mother handed it to me at the airport back home, her hands shaking, her eyes already red from crying. "Go," she said. "Make a better life. Send money when you can. Forget us if you must, but survive." I was 25, alone, and terrified. The flight felt endless. I pressed my face against the window and watched my country disappear beneath the clouds, wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. The answer, I'd learn, was both yes and no. The first year was brutal. I lived with a cousin I barely knew in a cramped apartment that smelled like mildew and old cooking oil. 7 of us in 2 bedrooms, sleeping in shifts, sharing 1 bathroom. I worked 3 jobs, cleaning offices at night, washing dishes at a diner during the day, and babysitting on weekends. My hands were raw, my back ached, and I cried myself to sleep more nights than I can count. But I sent money home every month. Every single month. Because that's what you do when you're the hope your family clings to. Eventually, I found steadier work through an agency that placed domestic workers in wealthy homes. The pay was better, the hours more predictable, though the work itself was just as hard. I cleaned penthouses where people owned more shoes than I'd owned meals some weeks. I scrubbed toilets in mansions where the guest bathrooms were bigger than my childhood bedroom. I learned to be invisible, to move through spaces like a ghost, to never make eye contact unless spoken to first. I was good at it. Too good, maybe. That's how I ended up working for families who barely remembered my name, but trusted me with their most intimate spaces. Then, 3 years ago, the agency called with a special placement. A client was looking for a live-in housekeeper with flexibility and discretion. The pay was exceptional, they said, but the hours would be long and the employer demanding. His name was Richard Whitmore. I recognized it even then. Everyone did. Tech billionaire, founder of some app that everyone used but no one could quite explain. He'd been in the news recently, not for business, but because his wife had died in a car accident 6 months earlier, leaving him with a 3-year-old daughter. I arrived at the house on a grey Tuesday morning, my single suitcase feeling heavier with every step up the long driveway. The house was massive, all glass and steel and sharp angles, perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific. It looked like something from a magazine, cold and beautiful and completely intimidating. A woman in a crisp suit met me at the door. She introduced herself as Richard's assistant, gave me a quick tour, and handed me a folder thick with instructions. Cleaning schedules, dietary restrictions, security codes, emergency contacts. "Mr. Whitmore travels frequently for work," she said in a tone that suggested I shouldn't ask questions. "You'll be responsible for maintaining the household and helping with Sophie when needed. The previous nanny just quit, so until he finds a replacement, you'll need to step in." She didn't wait for me to agree. She just assumed I would. My room was small but clean, tucked behind the kitchen with a view of the service entrance. A single bed, a narrow closet, a private bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. It was the nicest place I'd lived since arriving in this country. That afternoon, I met Sophie for the first time. She was sitting on the floor of the living room, surrounded by toys she wasn't playing with, staring out the enormous windows at the ocean. She didn't turn around when I walked in. "Hello," I said softly in English, my accent thick but clear. "My name is Carmen. I'm going to be working here now." She looked at me then, and I'll never forget her eyes, big, dark, too serious for a child. She studied me for a long moment, then returned to staring at the waves. "Okay," she said, her voice so small I almost didn't hear it. That was our first conversation. For the first few weeks, Sophie barely spoke to me. She was polite but distant, the kind of distance that felt learned, like she'd already figured out that adults came and went and there was no point getting attached. Richard was almost never home. When he was, he moved through the house like a stranger, distracted and restless, his phone always glued to his hand. He'd give Sophie a quick kiss on the head, ask her a vague question about her day, and disappear into his office before she could finish answering. I watched it happen over and over, this quiet rejection that Sophie absorbed without complaint. The nanny he hired lasted 2 weeks before she quit. Then another came, lasted 3 weeks, quit, then another. I lost count. They all said the same thing. The hours were impossible, Richard's expectations were unreasonable, and Sophie was too attached or not attached enough, depending on who you asked. The truth was simpler. Sophie was a little girl who'd lost her mother and was losing everyone else too. So I stayed, not because it was my job, but because someone had to. I started small. I learned her routines, her preferences, the tiny details that made her feel safe. She liked her toast cut into triangles, not squares. She wanted her nightlight on, but the closet door closed. She hummed the same song under her breath when she was nervous, something her mother used to sing. I didn't know the words, but I learned the melody and hummed it back to her one night when she couldn't sleep. She turned to look at me, surprise and something softer flickering across her face. "You know it," she whispered. "A little," I lied. "Can you teach me the rest?" And just like that, a door opened. Over the next few months, Sophie and I developed our own language. Not just words, but rhythms and rituals. Every morning I'd knock on her door 3 times softly so she'd know it was me. She'd stumble out in her pajamas, hair a mess, and climb onto the kitchen stool while I made breakfast. We'd eat together in the breakfast nook, sunlight streaming through the windows, and she'd tell me about her dreams. Some were silly, flying horses and talking clouds. Others were darker, full of shadows and missing pieces. I never pushed, just listened, and eventually she started asking me questions too. "Where are you from?" she asked one morning, syrup on her chin. "Far away," I said. "A place with mountains and music and people who talk loud and laugh louder. Do you miss it?" I paused, butter knife in hand. "Every single day." She nodded, serious. "I miss my mom every single day too." And there it was, the thing neither of us could fix, but both of us understood. Richard didn't notice, or maybe he did and didn't care. He was drowning in his own grief, his own guilt, burying himself in work because it was easier than facing the empty house and the daughter who looked so much like the wife he'd lost. I didn't judge him, not really. Grief makes people cruel sometimes, makes them run when they should stay. But I also didn't excuse him, because while he was running, Sophie was standing still, waiting for someone to notice she was disappearing too. So I noticed. I showed up for every school event he missed. I helped her practice her letters and numbers, celebrated when she finally learned to tie her shoes, held her when she cried because the other kids had both parents at pickup and she only had me. Slowly, carefully, I became the constant in her life, the one who didn't leave. Thank you so much for listening to Sophie's story so far. It means the world to me that you're here. If this is hitting close to home, drop the word invisible in the comments below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. There's so much more to tell, and I need you with me for what comes next. By the time Sophie turned 5, I'd stopped thinking of myself as just the housekeeper. I was something else, something without a title, something that existed in the spaces between employee and family, between stranger and mother. I knew her better than anyone. I knew she was scared of thunderstorms but pretended to be brave. I knew she picked the raisins out of her oatmeal when she thought I wasn't looking. I knew she had a loose tooth she wiggled constantly, excited and nervous about losing it. I knew she hummed when she was happy and went very quiet when she was sad. I knew when she needed a hug and when she needed space, when to push her and when to let her be. I knew her in the way you know someone you've cared for every single day, someone whose rhythms have become your rhythms, whose happiness has become essential to your own. And she knew me too. She knew I was tired on Mondays because I'd worked all weekend. She knew I missed my family back home, that I sent them money every month, that I cried sometimes when I talked to my mother on the phone. She knew I was afraid of mice and loved chocolate and sang off key when I cleaned. She knew I was hers. I started driving her to school every morning after the third meltdown with the hired drivers. We'd drive with the windows down, music playing softly, and Sophie would narrate everything she saw. Dogs, clouds, the mailman, the lady with the red hat. At school, I'd walk her to her classroom, make sure she had her lunch and homework, and kiss her forehead before she went inside. The teachers started greeting me by name, assuming I was her mother. I corrected them at first. "I'm just the housekeeper," I'd say. But Sophie would look up at me with those big eyes, and I could see the hurt flicker across her face every time I said just. So eventually I stopped correcting them. After school, we'd come home and I'd help Sophie with her homework at the kitchen table. Evenings were ours too. I'd cook dinner, real food, dishes from home that filled the sterile house with warmth and smell and life. Sophie loved it all. She'd sit at the counter, swinging her legs, telling me about her day in exhausting detail. Every tiny social interaction, every game at recess, every art project and scraped knee and hurt feeling. I absorbed it all, asked questions, validated her emotions. Bath time was a negotiation. Sophie hated getting her hair washed, would argue and delay and try every excuse. But I'd make it fun, letting her play with bubbles and cups, telling her stories to distract her while I worked shampoo through her curls. Stories about princesses and dragons, about little girls who were braver than they knew, about faraway places where the sky was bigger and the stars brighter. Then came the part I treasured most, bedtime. I'd tuck her in, pulling the covers up to her chin, and she'd ask for a story, even though she always asked and I always said yes. I'd read until her eyelids drooped, until her breathing evened out, until her small hand went slack in mine. Then I'd sit there a few minutes longer, watching her sleep, marveling at how peaceful she looked. Sometimes she'd wake in the middle of the night, crying from nightmares. I'd hear her through the walls and go to her without hesitation. She'd be sitting up in bed, face streaked with tears, reaching for me before I even crossed the threshold. "I'm here," I'd whisper, climbing into bed beside her, pulling her against my chest. "You're safe. I'm right here." "Don't leave," she'd mumble, already half asleep again. "Never. I'd promise. And I meant it. God help me, I meant it." Sophie started calling me Mama Carmen, just to herself at first, under her breath, testing out the sound of it. I pretended not to hear, though my heart lurched every time. Then she said it to me directly one morning while I was braiding her hair. "Mama Carmen, can we have pancakes?" I froze, hands still tangled in her curls. "Sophie, sweetheart, you should call me Carmen, just Carmen." "Why?" "Because I'm not your mama." "But you feel like my mama." I didn't know what to say to that. How do you explain to a 5-year-old that love and titles don't always match? That the person who acts like your mother isn't always allowed to be called one? I couldn't. So I just finished her braid in silence, and she didn't bring it up again, but the name stuck. When we were alone, she'd call me Mama Carmen, and I stopped correcting her. It felt too cruel. She needed to call someone Mama, and I was the only one there. Then came the dinner party. Richard had been planning it for weeks, some crucial meeting with investors that could make or break his next venture. He hired caterers, florists, a team to clean the already spotless house until it gleamed. For once, he cared about appearances, about showing these people that he had everything under control. I stayed in the kitchen that night, managing the chaos. Sophie had been tucked into bed hours earlier, extra clingy that evening, asking me 3 times if I'd be there when she woke up. "Always," I'd promised. But around 9 o'clock, I heard footsteps on the stairs, small, uncertain footsteps. My heart sank. I turned just as Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, eyes wide and scared, clutching her rabbit so tight her knuckles were white. She'd had a nightmare. The dining room was full of voices, laughter, the clink of expensive glasses. Richard was mid-pitch, his voice confident and smooth. None of them knew she was there. But Sophie wasn't looking at them. She was looking at me. She ran across the kitchen and wrapped her arms around my legs, burying her face in my apron. "Mommy," she sobbed, "I had a nightmare. There were monsters and you weren't there and I was so scared." The word hung in the air. "Mommy, not Mama Carmen, just Mommy," said loud enough that one of the servers heard. Then another. Then one of the investors' wives turned in her chair and stared. The ripple of awareness spread through the room like wildfire. Conversations stopped. Heads turned, and suddenly everyone was looking at us. The maid and the little girl calling her Mommy. Richard's face went white, then red. I could see the panic in his eyes, the humiliation, the rage. I tried to fix it. "Sophie, honey, I'm not—" But she cut me off, confused and hurt. Yes, you are. You're my mommy. You take care of me every day. You read to me and make my breakfast, and you're always here. That makes you my mommy. One of the investors' wives whispered something to her husband. He frowned. Richard stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor, the sound sharp and violent. Upstairs, now. He wasn't talking to Sophie. He was talking to me. I gently peeled Sophie's arms from around my legs, my hands shaking. Go back to bed, mi amor. I'll come check on you in a little while. Promise. Promise. See, she hesitated, sensing something was wrong but not understanding what. Then she shuffled back toward the stairs, looking over her shoulder at me one last time before disappearing. Richard followed me into the hallway, his face twisted with an anger I'd never seen before. What the hell was that? She had a nightmare. She was scared. She called you mommy. I didn't tell her to. I've never encouraged. You've been poisoning her against me. You've been making her think you're her mother so you can what? Manipulate me? Get more money? Take advantage of a grieving child? I stared at him, shocked. That's not. I would never. You're fired. Pack your things. I want you out of this house by morning. The words hit like a slap. Mr. Whitmore, please. Sophie needs someone who knows their place. You clearly don't. Leave. Now. He walked back into the dining room, forced smile plastered on his face, and I stood there in the hallway, the walls closing in, my whole world crumbling. I didn't sleep that night. I packed my things in a daze, shoving clothes into my suitcase, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind screamed. Around midnight, I heard scratching at my door. Then a small voice. Carmen, are you in there? Sophie. I opened the door and she rushed in, tears streaming down her face. Why are you packing? Where are you going? I have to leave, sweetheart. Why? Because of me? Because I called you mommy? Her voice broke on the word, and I nearly broke with it. No, this is not your fault. Do you hear me? None of this is your fault. Then don't go, please don't go. Everyone leaves. She collapsed against me, sobbing, and I held her, my own tears finally falling. I don't want to leave, but I don't have a choice. Yes, you do. Just stay. I'll be good, I promise. I won't call you mommy anymore. I'll call you whatever you want. Just please don't leave me too. I held her until she cried herself out, until her sobs became hiccups, became silence. Then I carried her back to her room, tucked her in, and sat beside her until she fell asleep. Before I left, I kissed her forehead and whispered, I love you, mi amor. I will always love you. Don't ever forget that. By dawn, I was gone. I moved in with Maria, sleeping on her couch, crying into her shoulder. I knew this would happen, she said gently. What do I do? You move on. You find another job. You survive. But I couldn't move on, because 2 days later, the school called. We're trying to reach Mr. Whitmore. Sophie hasn't been to school in 3 days. Is everything all right? My blood went cold. I don't work there anymore. Oh, do you know who we should contact? I couldn't let it go. That night, I called the house. No answer. I called Richard's assistant. She was annoyed. He's traveling. Sophie's fine. By who? That's none of your concern anymore. 3 days later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. Is this Carmen Rodriguez? Yes. This is Linda Chen with Child Protective Services. We have a child here, Sophie Whitmore. She gave us your number and said you're the person we should call. My heart stopped. What happened? Is she okay? We found her alone in the house. The door was locked from the outside. She'd been there for 2 days with no food except crackers. Can you come down to the office? I was in my car before she finished the sentence. When I arrived, Sophie was sitting in a small room with plastic chairs and fluorescent lights. The moment she saw me, she ran. I caught her and she wrapped herself around me like she was afraid I'd disappear. "You came," she whispered. "Of course I came. Always." The social worker explained what happened. Richard had left for a business trip, told the new nanny he'd be back in 2 days. But his meetings ran long, and he didn't come back. The nanny assumed someone else was handling it and left. No one checked on Sophie. She'd been alone, hungry, scared for 48 hours. "She's malnourished and dehydrated, but otherwise physically okay," Linda said. "Emotionally, she's traumatized. We're opening an investigation into neglect." When Richard finally showed up, 6 hours later, he looked exhausted and defensive. "This is a misunderstanding." "You left your daughter alone for 2 days," Linda said, her voice hard. "That's neglect." "I'm a busy man. I can't be expected to—" "Yes, you can. You're her father." That was the beginning of the investigation, and the beginning of my fight. Hey, I know this is heavy. If you're still with me, thank you. The hardest parts are coming, but so is the hope. If you want to see how this ends, hit that subscribe button now. You won't want to miss what happens next. The weeks after Sophie was found alone were a blur of court dates, social workers, lawyers, and paperwork. I hired a lawyer, or rather, the community center connected me with one who did pro bono work for immigrant families. Her name was Angela Torres, a second-generation Latina with sharp eyes and sharper suits. She sat across from me in her cramped office and listened to my story without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back and said, "This is complicated." "I know." "You weren't her legal guardian. You weren't family. Technically, you were just an employee." "I know that too. But you were the one who raised her." I nodded, throat tight. She explained the legal reality. I had no parental rights. None. Even if I'd been caring for Sophie for years, even if I loved her like my own, legally, I was nobody. But there was a case to be made for visitation rights as a psychological parent, someone who'd formed a significant bond with the child. It was rare, almost unheard of, especially for someone in my position, but Angela thought we had a shot. "The court cares about the child's best interest," she said, "and right now, Sophie's best interest is having you in her life. We just have to prove it." The first hearing was in a cold, sterile courtroom. Richard showed up with 3 lawyers in expensive suits. I showed up with Angela and a folder full of evidence. Richard's lawyers painted him as a devoted father struggling with grief, doing his best under impossible circumstances. They made me sound like a problem, a maid who overstepped, who manipulated a grieving child, who was now trying to exploit the situation. When it was our turn, Angela calmly dismantled their narrative. She presented months of text messages from Richard, instructing me to handle everything related to Sophie. School pickups, doctor appointments, bedtime, meals. "Miss Rodriguez wasn't just cleaning the house," Angela said. "She was raising his daughter, and Mr. Whitmore knew it." She showed photos, me and Sophie at the park, at her school play, at her 5th birthday party, just the 2 of us because Richard was traveling. She presented testimony from Sophie's teachers, who confirmed I was the one who attended every parent-teacher conference, who showed up when the child was sick or struggling. The judge listened carefully. At the end, she asked me directly, Ms. Rodriguez, what is it you're asking for? I stood, my voice shaking. I'm asking to stay in Sophie's life, not as a parent. I know I'm not her parent, but as someone who loves her and who she loves, someone who won't disappear. The judge said she'd review the evidence and issue a ruling in 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks were the longest of my life. When the ruling came, Angela called me. The judge ruled in your favor, partially. Partially. You've been granted supervised visitation, 2 hours, twice a week. It's not custody, but it's recognition that your relationship with Sophie matters. I started crying before she finished. Richard is required to facilitate these visits, Angela continued, and he's been ordered to attend parenting classes. If he violates these terms, custody can be reevaluated. The first visit was at a community center. A social worker sat in the corner, watching. Sophie arrived 10 minutes late. The moment she saw me, she froze. Then she ran, crashing into me so hard we almost fell over. You came back, she sobbed. I told you I would. We spent those 2 hours playing games, drawing, talking. She told me about her new nanny Patricia, about school, about a new friend. Then, quieter, she asked, Are you going to leave again? Not if I can help it. Promise? I hesitated. I promise I will always fight to be in your life, even when it's hard. She nodded. Okay, then I'll fight too. Over the next months, the visits became routine. It wasn't enough, but it was something. And slowly, Richard changed. Not overnight, but bit by bit. He attended the parenting classes. He cut back on travel. He hired Patricia full-time. He started having dinner with Sophie most nights, being present in a way he never had before. I don't think he did it because he suddenly became a better person. I think the court forced him to, and losing Sophie became a real possibility. But the reason didn't matter. What mattered was Sophie had her father back. One day, 6 months into the new arrangement, Richard showed up at one of the visits. He sat across from me while Sophie played nearby. I owe you an apology, he said stiffly. I didn't respond, just waited. I was so wrapped up in my own grief I didn't see what was happening. I didn't see how much you were doing, how much Sophie needed you. She still needs me. I know. That's why I'm here. I want to modify the visitation agreement. No more supervision and more hours, if you're willing. I was. We went back to court, and the judge approved. Now I see Sophie 3 times a week, unsupervised. I pick her up from school sometimes. We have sleepovers at my apartment once a month. It's not perfect. I'm still not her mother, not legally. But I'm in her life, and that's enough. A year after everything fell apart, I visited Sophie at the house for her 7th birthday party. The house was full of kids and laughter and chaos. Sophie ran up to me with frosting on her face. You made it. I wouldn't miss it. Later, she pulled me aside. I drew you something, she said shyly, handing me a folded piece of paper. I opened it carefully. It was a picture of 2 figures holding hands, one tall, one small, above them in wobbly letters. My family. I looked at her, my throat tight. You're in my family, she said simply. You always will be. I pulled her into a hug, holding her tight. You're in mine too, mi amor, always. So, here's what I learned through all of this. Family isn't always about biology. It's not about legal documents or last names. Family is about who shows up, who stays, who fights for you even when it's hard, even when the world tells them they don't have the right. I showed up for Sophie when no one else did, and she showed up for me in ways I never expected, gave me purpose and love and a reason to keep fighting. Did I go too far? Some people think so. There are still whispers. People who say, I should have known my place, should have kept professional boundaries. Maybe they're right. Maybe I did blur lines that shouldn't have been blurred. But I don't regret it. Not for a second. Because Sophie is thriving now. She's happy, confident, loved. She has a father who's learning to be present and a network of people who care about her. And she has me. Not as a mother, but as something just as important. Someone who will always choose her. So what do you think? Did I do the right thing or did I overstep? Was fighting for Sophie worth the cost? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, please subscribe. There are so many more stories like this. Stories about people who refused to give up, who fought systems that weren't built for them, who loved fiercely even when it hurt. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, you never know who's fighting a battle you can't see. Be kind, show up, and never underestimate the power of staying.